A Cub Pilot, from Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain. You may already know Mark Twain as the author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain was born in 1835 as Samuel Langhorne Clemens. In his autobiographical book, Life on the Mississippi, he wrote, "When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to be a steamboatsman. Other ambitions faded out, each in its turn, but the ambition to be a steamboatsman always remained. When he was a little more than 20 years old, Clemens achieved his boyhood ambition. He became a riverboat pilot. A riverboat pilot steers ships in and out of port, often through dangerous waters. In order to keep the ship from running aground, it's important for the pilot to remain constantly aware of the depth of the water. In Clemens' time, the water's depth was measured by throwing a line with a lead weight attached, which is why the men who read the line were called leadsmen. When a leadsman measured a depth of 2 fathoms, a fathom is 6 feet, he would cry out, "Mark Twain!" Twain is an old-fashioned word for 2. That cry gave Clemens the pen name by which we know him best. The following selection is from Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. There is one faculty which a pilot must incessantly cultivate until he has brought it to absolute perfection. Nothing short of perfection will do. That faculty is memory. He cannot stop with merely thinking a thing is so and so. He must know it, for this is one of the exact sciences. With what scorn a pilot was looked upon, in the old times, if he ever ventured to deal in that feeble phrase, "I think," instead of the vigorous one, "I know." One cannot easily realize what a tremendous thing it is to know every trivial detail of 1,200 miles of river and know it with absolute exactness. If you take the longest street in New York and travel up and down it, counting his features patiently until you know every house and window and lamp post and the big and little sign by heart, and know them so accurately that you can instantly name the one you are abreast of when you are set down at random in that street in the middle of an inky black night, you will then have a tolerable notion of the amount and the exactness of a pilot's knowledge who carries the Mississippi River in his head. And then, if you will go on until you know every street crossing, the character, size, and position of the crossing stones, and the varying depth of mud in each of these numberless places, you'll have some idea of what the pilot must know in order to keep a Mississippi steamer out of trouble. Next, if you will take half of the signs in that long street and change their places once a month, and still manage to know their new positions accurately on dark nights, and keep up with these repeated changes without making any mistakes, you'll understand what is required of a pilot's peerless memory by the fickle Mississippi. I think a pilot's memory is about the most wonderful thing in the world. To know the Old and New Testaments by heart and be able to recite them glibly, forward or backward, or begin at random anywhere in the book and recite both ways and never trip or make a mistake, is no extravagant mass of knowledge, and no marvelous facility compared to a pilot's mass knowledge of the Mississippi and his marvelous facility in the handling of it. I make this comparison deliberately, and I believe I am not expanding the truth when I do it. Many will think my figure is too strong, but pilots will not. A pilot must have a memory, but there are 2 higher qualities which he must also have. He must have good and quick judgment and decision, and a cool, calm courage that no peril can shake. Give a man the merest trifle of pluck to start with, and by the time he has become a pilot, he cannot be unmanned by any danger a steamboat can get into. But one cannot quite say the same for judgment. Judgment is a matter of brains, and a man must start with a good stock in that article, or he will never succeed as a pilot. The growth of courage in the pilot house is steady all the time, but does not reach a high and satisfactory condition until some time after the young pilot has been standing his own watch, alone and under the staggering weight of all the responsibilities connected with the position. When the apprentice has become pretty thoroughly acquainted with the river, he goes clattering along so fearlessly with his steamboat, night or day, that he presently begins to imagine that it is his courage that animates him. But the first time the pilot steps out and leaves him to his own devices, he finds out it was the other man's. He discovers that the article has been left out of his own cargo altogether. The whole river is bristling with dangers in a moment. He is not prepared for them. He does not know how to meet them. All his knowledge forsakes him, and within 15 minutes he is as white as a sheet and scared almost to death. Therefore, pilots wisely train these cubs by various strategic tricks to look danger in the face a little more calmly. A favorite way of theirs is to play a friendly swindle upon the candidate. Mr. Bixby, my chief, served me in this fashion once, and for years afterward I used to blush, even in my sleep, when I thought of it. I had become a good steersman, so good indeed, that I had all the work to do on our watch, night and day. Mr. Bixby seldom made a suggestion to me. All he ever did was take the wheel on particularly bad nights, or in particularly bad crossings, land the boat when she needed to be landed, play gentleman of leisure 9/10 of the watch, and collect the wages. The lower river was about bank full, and if anybody had questioned my ability to run any crossing between Cairo and New Orleans without help or instruction, I should have felt irreparably hurt. The idea of being afraid of any crossing in the lot in the daytime was a thing too preposterous for contemplation. Well, one matchless summer's day I was bowling down the bend above Island 66, brimful of self-conceit and carrying my nose as high as a giraffe's, when Mr. Bixby said, "I am going below a while. I suppose you know the next crossing?" This was almost an affront. It was about the plainest and simplest crossing in the whole river. One couldn't come to any harm, whether he ran it right or not, and as for depth, there had never been any bottom there. I knew all this perfectly well. Know how to run it? Why, I can run it with my eyes shut. How much water is there in it? Well, that's an odd question. I couldn't get bottom there with a church steeple. You think so, do you? The very tone of the question shook my confidence. That was what Mr. Bixby was expecting. He left without saying anything more. I began to imagine all sorts of things. Mr. Bixby, unknown to me, of course, sent somebody down to the forecastle with some mysterious instructions to the leadsman. Another messenger was sent to whisper among the officers, and then Mr. Bixby went into hiding behind a smokestack where he could observe results. Presently the captain stepped out of the hurricane deck. Next a chief mate appeared, then a clerk. Every moment or two a straggler was added to my audience, and before I got into the head of the island, I had 15 or 20 people assembled down there under my nose. I began to wonder what the trouble was. As I started across, the captain glanced aloft at me and said, with a sham of uneasiness in his voice, "Where is Mr. Bixby?" "Gone below, sir." But that did the business for me. My imagination began to construct dangers out of nothing, and they multiplied faster than I could keep the run of them. All at once I imagined I saw a shoal of water ahead. The wave of coward agony that surged through me then came near, dislocating every joint in me. All my confidence in that crossing vanished. I seized the bell rope, dropped it, ashamed, seized it again, dropped it once more, clutched it tremblingly once again, and pulled it so feebly that I could hardly hear the stroke myself. Captain Make sang out instantly, and both together, "Starboard lead there, and quick about it!" This was another shock. I began to climb the wheel like a squirrel, but I would hardly get the boat started to port before I would see new dangers on that side, and away I would spin to the other, only to find perils accumulating to the starboard and be crazy to get to port again. Then came the leadsman's sepulchral cry, "Deep 4!" Deep 4 and a bottomless crossing? The terror of it took my breath away. "Mark 3! Mark 3! Quarterless 3! Half Twain!" This was frightful. I seized the bell ropes and stopped the engines. "Quarter Twain! Quarter Twain! Mark Twain!" I was helpless. I did not know what in the world to do. I was quaking from head to foot, and I could have hung my hat on my eyes, they stuck out so far. "Quarterless Twain! 9½ We were drawing 9. My hands were in a nervousness flutter. I could not ring a bell intelligibly with them. I flew to the speaking tube and shouted to the engineer, "Oh, Ben, if you love me, back her! Quick, Ben! Oh, back the immortal soul out of her!" I heard the door close gently. I looked around, and there stood Mr. Bixby, smiling a bland, sweet smile. Then the audience on the hurricane deck set up a thunderous gust of humiliating laughter. I saw it all now, and I felt meaner than the meanest man in human history. I laid in the lead, set the boat in her marks, came ahead on the engines, and said, "It was a fine trick to play on an orphan, wasn't it? I suppose I'll never hear the last of how I was stupid enough to heave the lead at the head of 66. Well, no, you won't, maybe. In fact, I hope you won't, for I want you to learn something by that experience. Didn't you know there was no bottom in that crossing?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Very well, then. You shouldn't have allowed me or anybody else to shake your confidence in that knowledge. Try to remember that. And another thing. When you get into a dangerous place, don't turn coward. That isn't going to help matters any." It was a good lesson enough, but learned the hard way. Yet about the hardest part of it was that for months I so often had to hear a phrase which I had conceived a particular distaste for. It was, "Oh, Ben, if you love me, back her!